What if I told you that the DNA of modern Scots contains traces of Ice Age hunters, ancient farmers from the Near East, Bronze Age steppe migrants, Viking settlers, and even rare genetic lineages that may ultimately trace back to North Africa? For centuries, Scotland has been celebrated for its castles, clans, warriors, and proud traditions. But beneath the stories, passed down through generations, lies an even deeper history. A history written not in books, but in DNA. Modern genetic research has revealed that Scotland's population was not created by a single people or a single migration. Instead, it is the result of thousands of years of arrivals, settlements, alliances, cultural exchanges, and population movements. Some of the discoveries have been remarkable. Certain Scottish islands carry some of the strongest Norse genetic signatures found anywhere outside Scandinavia. Other regions preserve genetic patterns that stretch back to some of the earliest inhabitants of Britain. In some cases, DNA has revealed connections that historians never expected. So, who were the first Scots? Where did they come from? How much Viking ancestry remains today? And what secrets are hidden inside Scottish surnames? Today, we're taking a journey through 12,000 years of Scottish genetic history to uncover the surprising origins of the Scottish people. Before we begin, let us know your Scottish surname in the comments below. Names often preserve clues about ancient origins, and by the end of this video, you might see your family history in a completely new way. And if you enjoy exploring ancestry, genetics, and hidden history, be sure to subscribe and join us for more journeys into the past. The first Scots. Our story begins around 12,000 years ago. The last ice age was ending. Massive glaciers that had covered much of Scotland for thousands of years were retreating. As the climate slowly warmed, small groups of hunter-gatherers moved north into lands that had only recently become habitable. These were Scotland's first known inhabitants. They lived as nomads, moving with the seasons, hunting wild animals, gathering plants, and fishing along Scotland's rivers and coastlines. Life was difficult and uncertain. Yet these early pioneers laid the foundations for all who would follow. Although modern Scots carry only a relatively small proportion of their ancestry from this era, traces of these ancient hunter-gatherers still survive in the Scottish gene pool today. In a sense, some of Scotland's oldest bloodlines stretch back to these first settlers who arrived as the ice retreated. The arrival of the farmers. Then came a revolution. Around 6,000 years ago, a new population began arriving in Britain from continental Europe. These newcomers were farmers. Their ultimate origins lay much farther south, among agricultural communities that had spread across Europe from Anatolia and the Near East. Unlike the hunter-gatherers, these migrants brought crops, domesticated animals, pottery, and entirely new ways of life. The impact was enormous. Farming allowed larger populations to survive. And over time, these communities transformed the Scottish landscape. They built monuments that still stand today, including impressive stone circles, chambered tombs, and ceremonial sites. Some of the most famous examples include the standing stones of the Outer Hebrides and the great prehistoric monuments of Orkney. Genetic studies show that these farming populations contributed significantly to the ancestry of later Scottish populations. Yet another dramatic change was still to come. The North African connection. It is within these long chains of ancient migrations that some of Scotland's most unexpected genetic markers may have arrived. Some studies have identified rare ancestry signals that ultimately trace back to North African populations thousands of years ago. This does not mean there was a large-scale migration from North Africa directly into Scotland. Instead, it suggests that small ancestral lineages moved gradually across Europe through multiple migrations over many generations. Rare paternal lineages, such as haplogroup E1b1b, are found at low frequencies in Britain. These lineages ultimately originated much farther south and may have arrived through a variety of migration routes over thousands of years. Researchers have proposed that some of these lineages may have reached Britain through ancient population movements along Europe's Atlantic fringe, possibly involving Iberia and western France. These findings highlight an important truth about human history. Human populations have rarely been completely isolated. Over long periods of time, even rare genetic lineages can travel extraordinary distances, becoming woven into populations far from their original homeland. The Great Beaker Transformation. Around 4,500 years ago, a new culture began spreading across Britain. Archaeologists call them the Beaker people, named after the distinctive bell-shaped pottery they left behind. For years, researchers debated whether these newcomers represented a new culture or a new population. DNA studies have now provided a remarkable answer. Evidence suggests that within a relatively short period, Britain's genetic landscape changed dramatically. Ancient DNA studies indicate that within a few centuries, much of Britain's ancestry became linked to populations associated with beaker migrations from continental Europe. These migrants carried ancestry connected to Yamnaya-related steppe populations that had previously spread across much of Europe. In many ways, this was one of the most important genetic turning points in British history. The descendants of these Bronze Age migrants would become a major ancestral component of the people who later inhabited Scotland, helping reshape Britain's genetic landscape. The Celtic Question. Now we arrive at one of the most debated chapters in Scottish history. The Celts. Many people assume that Celtic tribes simply invaded Scotland and replaced the people already living there. But the truth appears far more complex. Historians and archaeologists continue to debate exactly when Celtic languages reached Britain. Some researchers believe Celtic languages spread during the later Bronze Age. Others argue that the process occurred during the Iron Age. What seems increasingly likely is that cultural change often spread faster than people themselves. Rather than mass replacement, many local populations may have gradually adopted Celtic languages, beliefs, technologies, and customs through trade, alliances, and cultural exchange. Over time, Celtic culture became deeply rooted across much of Scotland. Different regions adopted these influences at different rates, helping create the regional diversity that would characterize Scotland for centuries. The Picts, Scotland's mysterious people. Among the most fascinating peoples of ancient Scotland were the Picts. To the Romans, they were the Picti, often translated as the painted people. For centuries, the Picts have been surrounded by mystery. Who were they? Were they fundamentally different from other peoples living in Britain? Modern genetics has provided some important new clues. Ancient DNA studies suggest that the Picts were not exotic invaders from a distant land. Instead, they appear to have been closely related to the local Iron Age populations already living across much of Britain. Recent research indicates that Pictish populations shared strong genetic similarities with neighboring populations throughout Britain, supporting the idea that their uniqueness was primarily cultural and political rather than biological. Yet their influence on Scottish history was enormous. For centuries, Pictish kingdoms dominated much of northern and eastern Scotland before eventually becoming integrated into the emerging kingdom of Alba, the Romans and their limited legacy. When the Romans arrived in Britain in 43 AD, they eventually pushed northward into parts of what is now Scotland. However, Scotland proved difficult to conquer. Roman armies advanced, built forts, and established temporary control in some areas, but they never fully incorporated Scotland into the Roman Empire. As a result, the Roman genetic contribution to Scotland appears relatively limited. While there is evidence of some Mediterranean and continental ancestry entering Britain during the Roman period, particularly through soldiers, traders, and administrators drawn from across the empire, the overall genetic impact appears relatively small. The Romans influenced Scotland's history, but they did not fundamentally reshape Scotland's population. The Vikings arrive. Then came the Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, Norse raiders started appearing along Scotland's coasts. What began as raids eventually became settlement. And nowhere was this influence stronger than in Scotland's northern islands. Orkney and Shetland became major centers of Norse settlement. For generations, these islands remained deeply connected to the Scandinavian world. Today, genetic studies reveal just how profound that influence was. In Orkney and Shetland, a substantial proportion of ancestry can be traced to Norwegian sources. Even on mainland Scotland, Norse ancestry remains detectable, though usually at lower levels. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Despite centuries of Viking activity, most Scots are not primarily descended from Vikings. Instead, Norse ancestry became one thread woven into an already complex genetic tapestry. Yet, in certain island communities, the Viking legacy remains among the strongest found anywhere outside Scandinavia. If you've taken a DNA test, many of these ancient migrations are hidden within the broad regional categories you see today. A result labeled Scottish may actually contain genetic threads connecting you to multiple migrations that occurred thousands of years apart. Behind a single percentage on a DNA report lies a much deeper story stretching back to the first settlers who entered Scotland after the Ice Age. So far, we've uncovered traces of Ice Age hunters, ancient farmers, Celtic-speaking communities, and Viking settlers. But some of the most surprising discoveries are still ahead. If you're enjoying this journey through Scotland's past, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps more people discover these fascinating stories hidden within our DNA. The Steppe Ancestry Revolution. As we look at the modern genetic map of Scotland, it is important to understand the scale of the Bronze Age transformations we mentioned earlier. Around 5,000 years ago, pastoralist groups associated with the Yamnia culture expanded across large parts of Europe. These people are linked to what geneticists call Steppe ancestry, a major ancestral component found in many modern European populations. Rather than representing a single tribe, they were part of a broad network of migrating communities who helped spread innovations such as wheeled transport, new forms of animal husbandry, and possibly some of the Indo-European languages that would later dominate much of Europe. Today, modern Scots carry substantial amounts of steppe ancestry, reflecting the wider genetic transformation that affected much of northwestern Europe during the Bronze Age. This ancestry became one of the major building blocks of the Scottish population and remains an important part of Scotland's genetic story today. But Scotland's story does not end with ancient migrations. In fact, some of the most fascinating discoveries come from the way different parts of Scotland developed their own unique genetic identities. Scotland's genetic regions. For centuries, mountains, islands, rivers, and stretches of open sea helped separate communities from one another. As a result, different regions of Scotland developed distinct genetic signatures. Large-scale DNA studies have revealed that Scotland is not genetically uniform. Instead, it contains several regional clusters shaped by geography, migration, and history. Among the most distinctive are Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles, the Northeast, and the Borders. These patterns reveal how local populations remained connected to some regions while remaining relatively isolated from others. One of the most striking findings is a long-standing genetic contrast between northeastern and southwestern Scotland. This division broadly reflects ancient settlement patterns, historical boundaries, and centuries of regional development. In other words, Scotland's genetic landscape mirrors its history. The map of Scottish DNA often overlaps with the map of Scotland's past, Highlands and Lowlands. One of the most famous divisions in Scottish history is the distinction between the Highlands and the Lowlands, although the line between them was never absolute. The two regions followed somewhat different historical paths. The Highlands remained strongholds of Gaelic language and culture long after other parts of Scotland had changed. The rugged terrain and relative isolation of many Highland communities helped preserve older traditions and family networks. Meanwhile, the Lowlands experienced stronger influences from neighboring England, Anglo-Saxon settlement, Norman migration, trade, and later urbanization. These differences were cultural, linguistic, and to some extent genetic. Yet modern DNA studies show that despite regional distinctions, Highlanders and Lowlanders ultimately share deep common ancestry stretching back thousands of years. The differences are real, but the shared foundations run even deeper. Orkney and Shetland, Scotland's genetic time capsules. Nowhere is Scotland's genetic uniqueness more visible than in Orkney and Shetland. Located far to the north, these island groups developed along a very different historical path from much of mainland Scotland. For centuries, they were closely connected to Scandinavia. Norse settlers established powerful communities there, and the islands remained under Norwegian rule long after Viking expansion elsewhere had slowed. Modern DNA studies reveal just how lasting that legacy has been. Orkney and Shetland possess some of the strongest Norse genetic signatures found anywhere outside Scandinavia itself. But Viking ancestry is only part of the story. Because of their relative isolation, these islands also preserve genetic patterns that help researchers understand older population movements throughout Britain's history. In many ways, Orkney and Shetland act as living genetic time capsules. Their DNA preserves clues to multiple chapters of Scotland's past. Before we continue, we'd love to hear from you. Have you taken a DNA test or researched your family tree? Did you discover anything surprising about your ancestry? Share your story in the comments below. Your family history might contain connections to some of the very migrations we've discussed today. And if you're enjoying this exploration of Scotland's past, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future journeys into ancestry and genetic history. The story of Scottish surnames. One of the easiest ways to see Scotland's layered history is through its surnames. Although surnames do not always perfectly reflect a person's DNA, they often preserve clues about ancestry, geography, language, and cultural identity. Many Scottish surnames reflect Gaelic origins. Names beginning with Mac or Meki simply mean son of. MacDonald means son of Donald. MacGregor means son of Gregory. MacIntyre means son of the carpenter. These names preserve a direct connection to Scotland's Gaelic past. Other surnames reveal Norman influence. Following the Norman period, families of continental European origin established themselves throughout Scotland. Names such as Bruce, Fraser, and Stuart trace their roots to Norman or Norman French families who became deeply intertwined with Scottish history. Scotland's Norse heritage is also preserved in many surnames, especially in the north and islands. Names such as Gunn and MacLeod reflect Scandinavian influences that survived long after the Viking Age ended. Lowland and border regions produced surnames such as Armstrong, while names like Douglas emerged from ancient Scottish territorial origins, tied to specific landscapes and places. Some surnames may even preserve echoes of much older regional identities dating back to the Pictish era. Together, Scottish surnames form a living archive of the peoples who shaped the nation. Every name tells a story. Some stories stretch back centuries, others stretch back millennia. The modern genetic picture. When all the evidence is combined, a remarkable picture emerges. Modern Scots are not descended from a single tribe, kingdom, or migration. Instead, Scottish ancestry represents thousands of years of human history layered one generation upon another. The first hunter-gatherers established Scotland's earliest known populations. Neolithic farmers transformed society through agriculture and brought new ancestry from continental Europe. Bronze Age migrations connected Scotland to wider movements sweeping across Europe. Celtic languages and cultures spread across the country, shaping identities that still survive today. Pictish kingdoms dominated large portions of ancient Scotland. Viking settlers left lasting genetic and cultural legacies, particularly in the north and islands. Normans, Flemings, Anglo-Saxons, and later migrants each contributed their own threads to the tapestry. Even relatively recent migrations, including significant Irish immigration during the 19th century, added further layers to Scotland's genetic story. Each wave left its mark, yet none completely erased what came before. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Scottish genetic history is not a story of simple replacement. It is a story of continuity, adaptation, and connection. Conclusion. So what does it really mean to be Scottish genetically? It means carrying a record of thousands of years of human movement, survival, and change. It means that hidden within the DNA of modern Scots are traces of Ice Age hunters, Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age steppe migrants, Celtic-speaking communities, Pictish kingdoms, Viking settlers, and many others whose names have long since disappeared from history. The Scotland of today was not built by one people. It was built by many peoples, whose stories gradually merged into one. And that may be the most fascinating discovery modern genetics has revealed. The deeper we look into the past, the less we find isolated bloodlines and pure origins. Instead, we find connections. Scotland's story is ultimately a story of migration, interaction, adaptation, and survival. In many ways, it is also the story of humanity itself. As genetic research continues to advance, new discoveries will undoubtedly reshape our understanding of Scotland's past. But one conclusion already seems clear. The Scottish people are the product of thousands of years of history, movement, and cultural exchange. Their story is far older, far richer, and far more complex than most of us ever imagined. Thank you for joining us on this journey through 12,000 years of Scottish genetic history. Until next time, thanks for watching.